right, let's get started. Okay, first of all, props to all of you guys for adhering to my on-time policy. That's awesome. I reward good behavior. So I'll make sure to take a look at that first test and adjust accordingly. So I promised, any questions before I get started? Anybody have anything that's bugging them? Anatomically, kinesiologically related? I thought of this dad joke. What do y'all think? Kinesiology, what's that? It's like, oh, it's just the study of the knee. All right, I'll keep working on it. So, global referencing class. First person is facing right side of class. No problem. Because remember, sometimes your cell device may be laying down, so we want to have a reference that we can all see. Thus, a global reference. Starts to do jumping jacks or these kind of motions. What plane would those movements occur in globally? From the room's perspective. Not this side of the class, not that side of the class, not this side of the class. Because once again, guys, each side may see different things, so we kind of have to have an option where we're all seeing the same thing to avoid confusion. So these movements, let me replicate it. What plane globally? Sagittal plane. Cool. Now here's the one we forget to associate. As planes and axes are married, and the divorce rate is 0. So if it's sagittal plane rotations, what axis must that occur about? Bilateral, absolutely. And for those of you that are kind of, it's okay. Guys, I didn't learn to ride a bicycle until I was 12. I'm a slow learner. What matters is that you're riding. It doesn't matter when. It doesn't matter if it was last week, today. The important thing is that you're riding, okay? So you may say, well, I don't understand, Campbell. Isn't that going through the front and the back of him? And the answer is, yeah. But since it was a global reference, it's going through the side and side of class. That's why it's bilateral from a global reference. Make sense? Okay. Next one. Usually I'm facing, yes ma'am. Anybody?
The caption says shoulders and hips. Would they both?
Say that one more time.
In the caption it says the shoulder, like identify the planes and axes of the shoulders and hips. They both
Absolutely. If they were doing, the first picture, you can't really see their hips, but if they were doing jumping jacks, they would move. Yeah. So the shoulder and hips are the same type of, we're going to go over this when we go into the specific, but they follow the exact same rules. Absolutely. So the reason I put this woman facing away is to kind of prove a point that it doesn't matter if she's here or if she's there. Like, it doesn't matter. I-10 is one road. Two different directions of movement, but it's one road. So if she's doing jumping jacks here, this would be frontal, the exact same as this would be frontal. That doesn't matter to the spin. Does that make sense? Just like it didn't matter the first guy, if he was facing here or if he faced here, it didn't matter to the plane or to the axes. Cool? Okay. And then the final one, okay, again, we have to give context. The view of this is from the top, okay? The view is from the top. So again, even though on the board it looks like she's, I don't know what that would be, like pressed up against a snow wall and using dark magic to levitate. Context clues can tell us, oh, we're just taking a picture from her on top. So from a global reference, wouldn't these same exact motions that we've seen so far be in the room's transverse plane? Cool? So we had an example of shoulder rotations in the global sagittal, the global frontal, and the global transverse. What that teaches us is that all of our joint motions can take place in all three global planes. It may look different, but this is the same as this, is the same as that from the joint's perspective, and that's why the names of the motions are going to be the same. Okay? Locally, to the joint's perspective, frontal, frontal, and frontal. Make sense? Yes, no, maybe so. Maybe so. Now let's associate those axes. Frontal, about an AP. So this is the front and the back of the guy's shoulder here. This is the front to the back of the woman's shoulder here. And this is still the front and the back of the girl's shoulder there. Get it? Quick content check. First of all, was this helpful? Is this helpful? Okay. Quick content check. A lot of times I'm going to ask you questions of a yes and a no fashion. However, the no, if it's no, great, we're done. But if it's yes, there's a follow-up question. Well, if the answer is yes, how or when, why, or that kind of stuff. So the name of this little practice game is the basketball moving in a plane? If the answer is no, we are done with that question. If the answer is yes, then there's a follow-up. What plane? And then for practice, I'm going to say what axis. Okay? All right. Question number 1. Is the ball, this is America's new and exciting game. Okay? Question number 1. Is the basketball moving in a plane? No. Good? Okay. Round 2. Is the basketball moving in a plane? Okay. If so, what plane? Sagittal. Now, for those of you that say, well, Campbell, you didn't differentiate local, global. I told you last class, if both are seeing the same, then I don't have to differentiate. I'm seeing sagittal, and everybody in this room sees sagittal from the room's perspective. Again, you guys see frontal, but what I see and what the room sees is the same. What axis? There you go. There's your bilateral axis. Cool? All right, next one. Is the basketball moving in a plane? No. Is it moving? Yeah. It's going to your left. It's going to my right. It's traveling east. It's traveling west. It's going in a straight line. Okay? All right? How about this one? Is the basketball moving in a plane? Yes. Now, there's translation also, but there's rotation also. That's general motion, the combination of those two. Okay? What global plane would the basketball be moving in? Frontal. Good. So if it's rotating in the frontal, what axis is it rotating about? AP, anterior posterior. So far, so bad? Okay. How about this one? Let's see. I did this. Yes or no? No. Good. Okay, what about this? Let's see if I can do this. Yes. How so? Transverse. About the what? Yeah. And my finger kind of gives you the axis, right? Transverse polar. I'm going to take out Creepy Mummy Ken. How you doing, Creepy Mummy Ken? I'm doing great, great. How you doing? Okay, I'm doing great, buddy. Okay. 3 shillings for the possessed toy. So remember last class I drew the little face, right? I was like, why draw a face when I have a face? So what I wanted Ken to show us is that, like, if this is my lower arm and I'm in anatomical position, my elbow is facing forward. This is the front, the anterior of my elbow in anatomical position. The anterior of my wrist, the anterior of my shoulder, the anterior of my knee, the anterior of my ankle. It's all, everything in the front is anterior, right? So from Ken's perspective, flexion, extension, into fetal, out of fetal, has nothing to do with, nothing to do. I told you, I'm going to teach you not to rely on angles. Heck, even if you say, well, flexion is a decrease of the anterior angle of the wrist. Ha, 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 ha. And you laugh with confident knowledge until I pronate my radial ulnar joint and inflection is in the back. And then you're getting the push-up confused because in your mind, flexion was a decrease of the front angle. So it's not that you can't play by those rules, it's just that those rules can be super confusing. But you know what's not confusing? Getting into fetal and getting out of fetal. That's not confusion, because that's what it's all about. That's why these things are called what they're called. Does it get you into a ball or does it get you out of a ball? And that's regardless of a global or local position. Fingers get into a ball, wrist get into a ball. Fingers get into a ball, wrist get into a ball. Fingers get into a ball, wrist get into a ball. This is still the anterior of my wrist, even though globally I might have made it posterior. It didn't change that this is the front of my wrist, because it's the front of my wrist wherever it is globally. This doesn't make it the top part of my wrist, just like this doesn't make it the bottom part of my wrist. Yes? Okay? All right, Ken, let's do one more. Sagittal plane for Ken. Because even when we're here, this is still his face. This is still the front. Even when we're here, this is still the front. Even when we're laying down doing snow angels, this is still the front. Cool? So joints, this is, it's a little tricky, but it's not tricky if you understand what I'm trying to preach to you. Joints can move in all 3 global planes. No problem. But they're only limited to move in so many of their planes. Either 1, 2, or 3. Uniaxial hinge joints, like the elbow, can only move in 1 plane at a time. If it moves in other planes, you've had a bad day. What I mean by that is your elbow is allowed to move in its sagittal plane. If it moves in its frontal plane, it's a bad day. Your wrist can only move in 2 of its planes. It's a biaxial ellipsoid joint. Don't write that down. If it moves in its transverse plane, you've had a bad day. That's what a high ankle sprain is. A high ankle sprain, when your foot gets twisted in the transverse plane, and sometimes I like to use big words that I spent a fortune on my education to memorize. The talocrural joint. So Brian, what'd you learn in school for 10 years? Talocrural joint? check this out. Anybody see that? Ooh, even better. Why have pictures when you have this? So what I'm trying to get you to see is that your ankle joint, and again, I'm going to go into more detail, but your talus lives inside this socket, we call it a mortise, formed by the tibia and the fibula. Look at this. Man, there's no room in there to do anything outside of this. Your ankle and your subtalar is like an inverse skateboard. Your tarsal bones provide the balance. You know how a skateboard kind of wobbles? And the ankle joint provides the wheels. Look in here. You know what this doesn't do? This. There's no room for that. So when someone lands on that side of the foot and they twist that ankle in the transverse plane and it doesn't allow motion in the transverse plane, I'm going to come to you right away, then sometimes you can have a sprain or a dislocation because the joint moved in a dimension it was not supposed to move in. It wasn't allowed for. You have insurance policies like bones and ligaments and muscles to prevent certain motions in certain planes. And when you have those motions in those forbidden planes, that's a bad day. Yes, ma'am?
So is that shoulder the only joint that can move in the transverse plane?
Ooh. Your shoulder and your hips are the only joint classifications that can move independently in all three planes. However, I'm going to teach you that you have some joints whose only option is to move in their transverse plane. Radial ulnar joint is going to be one of those, where the radius could wrap itself about the ulna or unwrap, and it's from a transverse plane this perspective. Your atlas axis in your head, which is a specialized cervical vertebra for spin, is only transverse plane. So sometimes you have like these sharpshooters who only do transverse plane stuff. What a great question. All right. It's like rascal flats. We're moving on. Position is where you are at. Motion is where you are going. So if I asked you guys, what is the position of his knee? What I do not want you to say, and again, I explain why. I do not want you to say flexion. Because flexion is a motion, not emotion. Man, flexion is so emotion. Flexion is the act of moving. Position is where you at. Sometimes those two things can match up. You can be flexed and be having flexion. But you could also be flexed and be having extension. Where are you at is relative to what position I told you guys. Anatomical position. So his knee is flexed, not because I told you so, but because in anatomical, his leg is straight. And now it's more in the field. But think about it, guys. This is a still picture. I have no idea if his foot is going towards the ball or if it's maybe a little bit going back. I don't know. It's just a still picture. I have no way of knowing how he's moving until I press play. Position is where are you at. His knee is flexed. His left hip is flexed. His left knee is flexed. His right hip is extended. His trunk is right laterally bent. His shoulders are abducted. His cervical vertebra is flexed and right transverse cervically rotated. None of that meant movement because I have no idea how he's moving. But I know where he's at. His left elbow is flexed. His left radial ulnar joint is pronated. So position is where are you at. His right knee is flexed. His right hip is flexed. His left hip, meh, it could be still in the anatomical position. His left knee is flexed. His right ankle is actually plantar flexed. And his left shoulder is externally rotated. His right elbow is flexed. His right wrist is flexed. Guys, I'm not asking you to write all this down, memorize it. I'm trying to teach through repetition. Position is where are you at. Motion is where are you going. How are you moving? Yes, ma'am.
So would it be like correct to say the soccer player's right knee is flexed, but it's going in extension, like the motion of extension is kicking?
Because we don't know.
What do you mean we don't know? He's gonna kick the soccer ball.
He's going to, but if I'm going to shoot a basketball, don't I have to go down before I come up? So if I froze the picture here with high resolution photography so there's no blur, how do you know if I'm coming up or going down?
You don't have to be video. Because then you have your knees flexed and you just want to assume you're doing an extension, but you don't know if you still.
And what's one of my commandments? We do not.
We don't assume, okay.
Absolutely. So, with fixed pictures gives us fixed data. With before and after pictures, that gives us more data. So a before and after picture, such as this, such as this, such as, oh, they took another one out. I don't know, it was kind of cheesy. Here we go. Such as this, before and afters. Well, now I have context. I know where I started. I know where I finished, and now I can not assume motion, I can infer motion. Make sense? Great question. And as a soccer professional or expert, you might be able to pick off certain clues in that fixed picture that say, no, I know absolutely he's going to extension. But that's why you're a soccer expert, right? Does that make sense? So what I'm trying to teach everybody is that without context, we do not assume. We can't assume he's going forward because he might still be cocking back. He might still be prepping. Yeah? So what today's lecture is about is how do we infer motion with still pictures? Your eyes, what we perceive as motion, are just still pictures. Y'all know what a flip book is? All right? You have a bunch of still pictures and then you do the flip book and it looks like it's moving. Heck, movies, the movie Reel, it's just a bunch of still pictures that when done in sequence looks like it's moving. The reason magicians always have the upper hand is because they can move their movements faster than our eyes can process the fixed pictures. Keep your eye on the ball. Good luck, because that ball's moving faster than what your eyes can keep up with. What you're doing is you're taking fixed position changes and filling in the gaps with old data. So great hitters use their calculators to predict where the ball is going to be, but they're not following the ball. Can't. It's moving too fast. So how do we infer motion? Well, with a before and after picture, it's pretty simple. Where am I at? Where did I go? How did I have to move to get there? That's basic physics. That's change in position. That's displacement. Example in layman's terms. I'm sleepy, and we're about to travel to Houston. Right before we even leave Lafayette, I close my eyes. We wake up. I didn't physically feel us moving. I just know I went to sleep in Lafayette and I woke up in Houston. So how did you have to move to get there? You had to travel west. Campbell, what if you went across the Atlantic? Stop. So it's the same thing. I start somewhat in anatomical. I finished in a flexed position. How did I have to move to get there? I had to have flexion. I had to have right shoulder flexion to get to my new position. Position is such an important concept because motion isn't based off of position changes. And ladies and gentlemen, we won't have fancy high-speed cameras in a majority of our workplaces. So I'm going to have to teach you how to rely, how to trust your eyes in an era where your eyes can be mistrusted. Looking for clues, looking for positions, and not just seeing movements. Because man, they can mess with you. All right? What if I did this? Start, finish. Well, I'm in a flexed position, and I ended in anatomical roughly, so I had to have extension to get there. Right shoulder extension, yeah. Now that would be from the right photo to the left photo. Make sense? On the test, all of my pictures are going to be from left to right, because that's how we read. But in class, we can double dip and go back and forth. Okay? Let's do a couple more before and after.
How are you going to be asking these questions on the test?
In English, I'm in save now.
Would you be more asking, if you had those questions out, would you say, would you be looking for flex or would you be looking for
I can ask any, so the answer to your question is how I ask my question. So I could ask, so I'm never going to say what I will do, but I can 100% communicate what I can do. I can ask, I can give you this picture 5 different times on the test. One of them I might ask you about plane. One of them I might ask you about axis. One of them I might ask you about position. One of them I might ask you about motion. One of them I might ask you about plane and motion. One of them I might ask you about plane and position. Like it's all what I can do, not necessarily what I will do.
the picture? I thought you said that like flex could be positioned on motion.
Oh, flex could be a position. Flexion. And I know it's in there, but that's what we're working through this, right? Flex, ooh, think of it like this. I'm a Carlton when I have an idea. Think of it, like who knows who Carlton is? I'm aging myself. Think of it like this. If you would travel, do you like to travel? Just a lot. Yes, great, awesome. She likes to travel. Every now and then you gotta stop. Restroom, gas, whatever. And your car is parked. Stopped. It's a position. Now you may be east or west of Lafayette, but you're no longer moving. You're no longer traveling east or moving east. Right? You're parked. So that's what flex could represent. Your position. Where are you at? So in other words, if my mom, if y'all have any moms or aunts or family members like my mom is the biggest warrior that I know. And my dad, who we travel a lot together doing fundraisers, and my dad plays music, and I just kind of strum along and try to keep up with it. My mom is the ultimate stalker. Like, she'll call my dad. Y'all stopped and just wanted to make sure it wasn't a wreck. Oh yeah, we just getting some gas. Because she's watching the little GPS. And it's moving and it's moving and it's moving. Hi, Mom. And it's moving, and then all of a sudden it stops. My position is where am I at? Motion is where am I going? So words like ED, flex, extended, abducted, internally rotated, externally rotated. That's where you're at. Flexion, extension, abduction, internal rotation, external rotation. Where are you going? And remember, if I've said it once, I've said it 1,000 times. And that's important because you guys have never heard this clarification of position and motion before. That's not your fault. Where are you at does not have to match up with where you're going. If you went on vacation to Florida, you're east of Lafayette, but you could be traveling west to come home. As you travel west, you are forever east until you get home. So I'm flexed, but I can be extending or have extension, but guess what? I'm still flexed because flexed is relative to this. Yes? I can be flexed and have flexion. I could be flexed and have extension. I could be extended and have flexion. I could be extended and have extension. That's okay. And for those of you that have heard the word hyper, all right, let's knock out hyper while it's on my mind. A hyperactive child is excessive energy beyond normal. Hypertrophy, hyperventilation, hyper and hypoglycemic. It's relative to a norm. And that's the same with hyper with joint motions. This is not flexion, extension, hyperextension. And you know why I know that? Because this is normal range of motion for me. Hyperextension would be beyond normal range of motion, just like hyperflexion might be beyond a normal range of motion. I could have hyperabduction. I could have hyperpronation. Any movement that's beyond a normal range can be considered hyper. What a beautiful question. Global and local reference. So the contortionist, so the question is about somebody who's super duper flexible, that could like get into a box and stuff. For us and the average person, super hyper. For them, super normal. That makes sense, right? That's normal range of motion for them. But it's not normal for us. Shaq is ridiculously tall for the average person. But Shaq to Shaq is like, I am what I am. That's not abnormal for me at all. What a beautiful question.
So when they have players who are like they go back beyond the norm, that's the same thing?
Well, but remember, we're trying to bring it back to movement.
Right.
Kickers have more mobility than the average person, but that doesn't necessarily mean they have they could, but like kickers are ridiculously flexible. Gymnasts are ridiculously flexible. It might be like that's what your body's supposed to do. But in today's society, and I'm not blaming today's society, it's just how we are, guys. Our ancestors used to move all day long. And you know what a lot of, not us because we're kinesiology majors, okay, I lie, I don't move a lot too sometimes. I sit in my desk and I do this, and then I'm watching a movie, I'm driving to work. We have a lot of hypomobility in our world. That's why we need you guys to get out there and help people who are hypomobile and help them have motion that their body owes them that would be normal in their world. Think of it like this, and I don't mean to drift off, but when you have questions, I want to answer them because they're beautiful and great questions. If you put your arm in a sling, that's why we don't sling anymore. We used to, but you know darn well if you put your arm in a sling for 2 weeks, when you get out, you're going to be tight. Well, you didn't move for 2 weeks. What do you expect? Movement is life. And if you don't move, you're going to lose. Move it or lose it. That's literally true. Okay?
So hyper is beyond the normal range?
Yes, yes.
Hypo is like less than the normal.
Absolutely, absolutely. So for you therapists out there, that you're going to be working a lot with this. Someone has hypomobility. They have less than normal, and that's going to lead to functional problems. Like, I know that we have some CrossFit trainers, some personal trainers. Sometimes people can't do proper lifts, maybe because they're lacking of certain range of motion in their ankles or in their hips, and other places are moving fine, but because of that limiting factor of hypomobility, they're having issues. So what do? You do a movement assessment. You find out, we have hypomobility here, we have hypomobility there. Sometimes you have hypermobility. Sometimes your vertebra, there's hypermobility, there's excessive shifting and movement in certain places. So that's okay. It's okay. But I'm here just to define that hyper isn't normal range of motion. It's excessive range of motion, and that could be relative or absolute, global or local. So think of this. Flexion, extension, hyperextend. I've heard people say that all the time, and I'm like, why pick that route? Why not go extension, flexion, hyperflexion? Why not go right lateral, left lateral, hyper left lateral? Like, think of the rules. Think of the inconsistency. Flexion, extension, hyperextension. Awesome. Right transverse, hyper left transverse. It's ridiculous. I like rules that fit all circumstances, so we don't have exceptions. That's why I don't like the English language, man. Too many rules and exceptions. I before E, except after, and I'm like, bro, you lost me on the except after. Okay? So, the next way we can infer motion, we don't have to have a before and after, we can just have a fixed photo. But if we just have a fixed photo, we have to give it purpose. So how do we give something purpose? Anatomical. Let me give you an example. You are in, and for those of you that are out of state or out of the country, I'm going to try to use cities, towns that you might be familiar with. If you're not, let me know. You are in Houston, Texas, okay? And home is Lafayette, because that's where the university's at. And I say, you're in Houston, Texas. How would you have to move to go back to Lafayette? You'd have to move east, all right? You're in Houston, Texas. How did you have to move to get to Houston, Texas? West. Super simple, right? So the same with joint motions. What is the position of my right shoulder? Is it more fetal or less fetal? More fetal. It's flexed. How would my shoulder have to move to go to anatomical? I'd have to have right shoulder extension to go home. How did my shoulder have to move to get here from anatomical? I had to have flexion. Yes? So we can infer motion with one picture if we have enough information to process. Where are you at? Where are you going? Or how did you have to go to get to where you're at? It's another way of saying the same thing. Yes, ma'am?
How is this closer to fetal? Because I don't know if I'm just doing it wrong, or isn't it like head down and your arms?
Not a problem. Not a problem. I'll be happy to go over that. So fetal position is a movement. It's a movement pattern of the whole body, right? But what makes up all those individual parts that get your whole body to individual joint motion? And we analyze motion joint by joint, right? One joint at a time. So because we analyze motion joint by joint, if I do something like this and I say all I care about is the position of my wrist, my elbow doesn't matter. I'm looking at my wrist. My shoulder doesn't matter. My shoulder doesn't matter. My wrist is flexed. Good so far? So if I say get into the tightest ball you can, aren't you going to do something like this? Okay. We're talking about shoulders, so my knees and my hips do not matter. My neck doesn't matter. My elbows do not matter. My shoulders had to have flexion to get into fetal. Cool? That's a great question. You didn't answer that question. ESPN has been lying to you because they just don't understand human movement. When ESPN is saying full extension, the only thing that's extended fully is the elbow. The shoulder's actually. So I blame ESPN. It's a class action suit. So, where are you at? Let's do a couple practice questions before I let you go. Oh, that's not good. Let's go here. Her shoulders would be abducted, right? Because I have a reference. But I have no clue if she's adducting, abducting, or no ducting. She could just be holding this position. True? So I have to give you context. I have to give you more. From here, she starts moving her shoulders back to anatomical. Well, now I know she has to have adduction. Make sense? How would she have to move her shoulders from anatomical to that position for the photo? Now I know she has to have abduction to get there. Make sense? Yes,
So
ma'am.
in this condition, would you say her shoulders are abducted?
That's all we can say without context. That's all we can say. What if she's not moving? Which she's probably not, right? We can't say she's moving when we have no context of movement. But you know what we do have context of? Her position. No doubt about that. And then I have to give you the context so that we can infer motion. We never assume. But with enough information, we sure as heck can infer. Okay, how about this? One. Awesome example. Kermit the Frog here. Happiness, Miss Piggy, all the world ever wanted from you, a dream come true. I'm so stupid. Yes? What's the motion of her left hip? You see me fishing? I'm fishing. Okay, I have extension, I might have flexion. Can I say what's the motion of her left hip? What if she's going up? What if she's going down? You know what probably is happening? Nothing. She's probably just holding this position and be like, dude, can you hurry up with the photo, please? That's like saying, if you're stopped on the 10th floor of a tall building and the elevator is stopped, that's like saying the elevator is moving. How do you know? It might be going up, it might be coming down, or it might just be stopped. But what I can say is that if anatomical is the lobby floor, how did you have to move to get to the 10th? Had to go up. How did you have to move to go back down to the lobby? You got to go down. But you have to have context. So what can we say? Her left hip is flexed. It's in a flexed position. Her right hip's in a flexed position. Her right knee is in a flexed position. Her left knee, still in anatomical. Guys, I'm never going to ask you any question that involves like, I think it's flexed at least a half a degree. That's not what I'm here for. Good job. Now, how can we infer motion? How did she have to move her hip to get to the picture? Left hip flexion. How would she have to move her hip to go back to anatomical? Left hip extension. And I could use layman's terms. What would be the motion of her hip if her foot goes up from here? Flexion. What about if her foot goes down from here? Extension. And foot goes up, well, that could be from the knee. I will say from the hip, right? Her foot goes up because of hip motion. So I can use layman's terms like that. But keep in mind, guys, hip flexion doesn't have to go with any linear point. If she's on her tummy, she could actually have flexion with her foot going down. Does that make sense? So don't get caught up with, well, if the foot goes up, it has to be this. If the foot goes down, it has to be that. Good? God, y'all have such great questions. Yes, sir.
For that picture, if you were, say, not asking about the left hip and the right hip, would it still be flexed?
Absolutely. Her hips are bilaterally flexed. Because we have a reference. What is that reference? Anatomical position. If she were, here's one way to prove it. If through Doctor Strange, Sorcerer, or Harry Potter, if her hips were to go back to anatomical, she'd have to have extension to go back home. And that tells me she has to be flexed relative to anatomical position.
Would it be the same to say that her left knee is extended, or would you just say anatomical?
God, you guys are the best. Oh my gosh, that was so great. So the question was, is her left knee an anatomical or is it extended? A lot of joints in the body are in Lafayette, meaning that on the interstate, I can travel to Baton Rouge or I could travel to Lake Charles. However, you have some joints, you're not in Lafayette. Some joints, you're in Jacksonville, Florida, and the only way to travel, in other words, you're at the end of the road. So Jacksonville, Florida is east of everything else. Does that make sense? So in the case of your knee, your anatomical position is as far as you can go. So those terms for joints like the knee, the elbow, the radial ulnar joint can be synonymous. My knee in anatomical position is fully extended because I can't go any further. And if I do, I have hyperextension beyond normal range of motion. But that's not for your first test. I'm just answering a question. Maybe some of you had the same question. Okay? Yes, ma'am.
I have a question. So my knees, like they hyperextend naturally.
Mm-hmm.
But if I were to go into stretch my hamstrings, my knee naturally wants to bend at an angle, so I can't keep my legs straight.
Yeah.
Why is that?
That's because your hamstring, semimembranosus, semitendinosus, biceps femoris, long head at your hip, both heads at your knee, are too tight. You're having what they call passive elastic. This is where I try to pretend I'm smart. What's happening is when you get to a range of motion, those muscles that cross both your hip and the knee, they're like too tight, and they're like, dude, if I'm going to move more in the hip, you got to give me some slack on the other end. And so you flex your knee to develop slack, and then they're like, okay, sweet, I can go further. Absolutely. And that's why people like me, I have no flexibility at all. When I do a sit and reach test, I don't even score because I'm so tight. But it's my knees have to flex because I have to put my hamstrings on slack so that my hips can move further. If I straighten out my knees, I got to give some in my hips. So it's a function of the stretchy material of those muscles that cross both the hip and the knees. You're going to do that in our camera. All right, guys. You guys are wonderful. Y'all are beautiful. Get out of here. We'll see you Friday. concept of extension. What I mean by that is, if I said, what's the definition of extension? And you say, movement away from anatomical. And I'd say, well, wait, I can move away from anatomical flexion. Does that make sense? So what I emphasized was the concept of extension is movement in the sagittal plane away from the field, and flexion is going into the field. That's all that means.
Okay.
Flexion
So we're
is
still
the
using
field.
anatomical basis.
As a measure of where you at.
Okay.
Because from here, I am flex.
Close to the field.
Yes, from here I'm extended. Correct. But technically, A and B, right? A and B. Technically, B is further extended than A, but I'm still in flexion band.
So this would be extension.
Yes.
Flex and extension.
Well, you can have flexion from anatomical, extension to anatomical, extension from anatomical, flexion to flexion from, extension to extension from.
Okay.
Yeah, practice.
Yes, sir.
I promise it's from practice, but that was about what flexion and extension mean.
Okay.
Flexion and extension mean in regard to the field, but in terms of where are you at and where are you going, that's anatomical.
Thank you so much.
You're very welcome, very much. Howdy.
I have a question about like the sagittal plane
Yeah.
and stuff like that. So we're talking about our strength coach, what softball team.
Was your strength coach from out of state or you just want to?
Is that state?
Look at the phone.
He was telling me about like the gymnast. He
Yeah,
said
yeah.
like with the gymnast you want to watch it from the side, going side or whatever.
Depending on the exercise, but in terms of the view.
Like this one right here.
Yeah.
Like he said that's a frontal axis and then a sagittal plane.
Because we're not talking about the same thing.
So
So he's right about the rotation, but remember what I was trying to make sense of is the view. So the strength and conditioning coach will never have to do this, but what do you want to do for them? You're going to do this a lot. You're going to have to look at x-rays. You're going to have to look at MRI scans. You're going to need that. So that's where the misconfusion is. I wasn't saying she's spinning on this. She's not spinning on this. I'm saying the view of an x-ray. See, lateral view. So what I'm talking about is the views.
Did you say that you would also
View. So I'm saying I'm not saying it's not spinning in the sagittal, but in terms of view, I'm trying to make X-ray and MRIs, because that was a big confusion. So they were saying, how can it be saturated? And we looked at images from the side and it's lateral. And that's why I'm trying to clarify that spin and axis is different from the view of something. A anterior posterior view or a lateral view. So I am not saying at all. See, planes motion based, planes motion based, and that's it's getting to a views. That's view. So like this view would be like a similar verbiage, whether it's a front view, a sagittal view, or a transverse view. And those planes aren't really planes of motion. I had some question. It's all about spin, but the reason I put it, it's all about spin. It's just like, it's all about the base. Yes, but this would be a lateral view of her. Because so many students get confused with working in a clinic, and they're like, but our MRIs and our x-rays, they talk about frontal views and sagittal views, and how does that make sense? And I'm like, well, if you were going to see something spin in the sagittal, you want to look at it from the side.
Well, like, if you look at it from like a different angle, would you still consider like, if you were watching from side, now looking from there, if she's spinning on right side, is that still sagittal? And why is what is sagittal?
Not a problem. So it makes it sagittal for a couple of ways, but one we have to define. It would be her sagittal no matter what, because that's how she sees it, right? For me, I'm actually watching her in my frontal. I'm seeing frontal plane spin for me. Does that make sense? Because that bar is going through front and back. Both perspectives can be valid, we just have to communicate which one. If I change my view and come to the front, I apologize. Now we're both seeing sagittal. Problem. But if I wanted a scan, if I wanted to look at structures from the side, I wouldn't want an X-ray or an MRI from the front. So how that's communicated with these X-rays and MRIs is, I need a lateral view. I need a frontal view. I'm looking at like slices that would occur. And if I wanted a sagittal view, I would look at slices that would see me a sagittal view would be from the side, a frontal view would be from the front, a transverse view would be from the top. That's what the planes and stuff, the way the motions work, is sagittal rotations are going to occur in this way. So, right, but that's for view. Keep in mind, the rotation is going to be parallel to the view. Yeah. So the confusion with this is 100% correct about the spin. I was trying to clarify the view. If that gymnast was to get but an X-ray of her body, that would not be a view of that image. Yes, her spin is 100%. But X-ray and MRIs are not doing that. Oh, 100%. I was like, from over that. Yeah. Anything that gets you to feel is going to say 100%. Sagittal views, twisting. Most of it depends on your position, right? So the knees and the hips would be mostly sagittal. However, the reason you group is so that you can create like an arch. So you can have a combination. So just like you can have a northeast, northwest, southeast, southwest, you can have pure frontal, pure sagittal, and then this combination. I have entered the phase in 310 where I have students coming and saying, well, my coach said this. No problem. No problem. Let's see where let's see where there's a misunderstanding. I'd much rather somebody come with me to talk about it than not. That's bad. Oh Lord, longest video ever.